Welcome to today's webinar, Supply Chains, Procurement and Smart Contracts with our Western Australian Chapter President. I'm Monique Fennick from Australasian Supply Chain Institute, and before we introduce our keynote, I'd like to run through some housekeeping for the webinar. Firstly, a technical check to ensure that everyone can hear me. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Thank you. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can chat to us in the chat box on your screen so that we can help you out. Two other housekeeping items. We'll be running some polls throughout the webinar, which we will publish anonymous results. So please help us keep today as interactive as possible and respond to those polls. The Q&A section is not anonymous. Instead, it allows you to post your questions to the panel and for other attendees to see. So please use this opportunity to provide answers and we'll provide answers to your questions in this webinar. We'll be awarding 1 CPD point to attendees from today's webinar. Just type CPD into the Q&A box so that we know to appoint you a CPD point that goes towards your registration or certification maintenance. The webinar is recorded and will be uploaded to the ASCI library for members tomorrow, and a closed LinkedIn group will be created for further discussion with our keynotes after today's webinar to continue the discussion. So to kickstart the webinar, may I introduce our host for today, Indrasen Naidu. Welcome, Indrasen, and over to you.
Thank you, Monique. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I trust everybody's safe and well within these COVID circumstances. Just for those of you who may not be familiar, and just as a reminder to others, ASCI is really about being an accreditation body for supply chain management, and it's a not-for-profit organization. We are keen on engaging our members with this professionalization agenda. As part of the agenda, there's a practitioner and professional registration scheme, as you can see on your screens, consisting of the various levels and the various programs associated with that. And a bit more into the registration scheme on the next slide, please, Monique, is supporting this is in terms of knowledge development. There's opportunity to study with us at ASCI. And if you look at the study programs, they span what, for those of you who would be familiar with the SCORE model, the levels of plan, source, make, deliver. So you have the entire spectrum. And on the next slide, for your benefit, you can see the details these programs offer and the opportunities, including the QR code for you to access in terms of pricing. So excellent opportunities for those of us that want to advance our professional development, both in terms of knowledge and in terms of registration. In the next slide, I'm pleased to share our big announcement for 2021. As some of you will be aware, we had to postpone our conference to next year, given the circumstances. We have 5 themes at the conference, which is really on a call of a decade for action, linked to the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. And today's conversation with Stephanie Rowland covers at least 3 to 5 of those themes. And thanks to the ASCI Advisory Board, this conference as a host of keynote speakers, including Jeanette Salem, Economic Affairs Officer on Circular Economy at the United Nations. So that's quite exciting to have somebody of that stature and profile giving us a perspective on a global issue. Now, moving forward to today's program, it's my pleasure to welcome Stephanie Rowland. Stephanie is with Allion Partners, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Stephanie at our conference earlier this year in Perth and on several occasions. She's a keen champion and advocate in supporting us in ASCI in the local chapter. So as you see, Stephanie brings with her presence a wealth of experience in law, mergers and acquisitions, intellectual property, across multiple jurisdictions. And today's topic is no doubt going to be exciting, and I personally am looking forward to that. On that note, Stephanie, over to you. You may be on mute, Stephanie, I think.
How's that? Is that better? Good. And all right. Can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Lovely. All right. Look, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for coming along today and joining us for this session. It's a real pleasure to be able to present on the smart contracts topic this morning. I want to say thank you to ASCI and the invitation, and to Indriston and to David and to Monique for making it happen. I have formal slides prepared, but I also find it's quite good to have an interactive session. So I will try and keep an eye on the chat. And if you've got questions through the sections, then feel free to post those. And I'll just try and glance from the slides to the chat and keep pace as we go. Through the presentation, we also have some polls, which we ask you to participate in. They're completely anonymous, but just to test the water in relation to some smart contract issues and smart contract sentiment. And the last thing I just have to mention is I do have a bit of a cough. I do not have COVID-19, but if I have to mute you just temporarily, then that's the reason why. So without further ado, we are talking about supply chains, procurement and smart contracts this morning. This is something of particular interest to me, as well as having a law degree. I have a tech background and I used to work at IBM and Motorola. And so the intersect of contract with technology is always something that's been of particular interest to me. In terms of the presentation breakdown, we're looking at smart contracts, just a brief overview of some current trends and lessons from early adopters, seeing what's been done in the last few years and what might be on the horizon, the role that smart contracts can play in innovation, and then legal impacts associated with those. Because regardless of how you actually form your contract and execute, there are the same underlying legal issues regardless of which jurisdiction that you're in. For them to start off with, we'll go on to number one. So this is current trends and lessons from early adopters, but let's just start with the basics and say, well, what is a smart contract? So next slide. Excellent. So it's a computerized transaction protocol that executes the terms of a contract. So what we're talking about is you have the terms of a contract, but then that is coded into a sequence, which then executes on certain conditions being satisfied or not satisfied down a standard path. So at that point, we just wanted to move into our first polling question, which is the organisation that you work for or with, does it have reservations around the adoption of smart contracts? Just thought we'd do an early poll about people's views or their organisation's views around, is this something that is being seriously looked at? Is it something that's seen as a bit high tech? What's the current sentiment around this? Now, Monique, sorry, will those results appear?
Yes, that's right, Stephanie. Just waiting, giving people just a few more seconds and then I'll publish those.
Fabulous. Also, what have we got? Lack of knowledge to adopt and implement. Okay. Too uncertain, too complicated. Interesting. Interesting. Or not applicable. Yeah, fair enough. And I think with any technological tool, it's good to examine the cost and benefit analysis of adoption and see if it actually works for you in context. So very good. So look, in that context, if we go to the next slide, what is it? To decode it, no pun intended, a smart contract is automated by software and runs on blockchain technology. Why blockchain? Blockchain provides an immutable sequenced record that is created in real time, which one of the distinguishing features is that it is not possible to go back and change blocks in the blockchain once the new blocks have been added. So with that idea in mind, then software is used to code the terms and conditions that need to be satisfied or not satisfied as the contract moves through from execution through all the different elements that are required to the end of the contract. So the idea is that, like a computer program, you have a contract that has a set of conditions. Those conditions may be presented in if statements. So if this happens, then that happens. They might be coded into forks. So if this condition is satisfied, we go down this path, but if this condition is satisfied, we go down that path. You can use loops of logic to say, for example, if there was a product being delivered, for every product that's delivered, then this needs to be checked, this needs to be checked, this needs to be checked, and then payment can be made. And so you can have loops. So what it's trying to extract from contracts is the logic behind the contract, then coded into a sequence, which can then self-execute. That's part of the theory behind the idea, right? Look, smart contracts basically create a record through which you can move and examine different conditions as to whether they've been satisfied or not satisfied to then give certain outcomes. So it does lend itself to being appropriate for supply chain problems in terms of the moving of goods or the supply of services and conditions around those in terms of type, quality, volume, locations from which they are sourced to where they are delivered, all of those sorts of things. Then the thinking is that those types of contracts could then be applied through using smart contract and blockchain technology. So that said, smart contracts are not contractual agreements in the traditional sense and need to be distinguished from digital contracts and automated contracts, which are basically just contracts put into either digital form or otherwise reduced from prose into a more software driven context, but aren't part of the blockchain. And so the benefit of having a smart contract that is, again, using the blockchain technology is that as conditions are satisfied and as performance is completed through the required time, that you create blocks in the blockchain to evidence that performance. And then the idea is that once those blocks are created, they can't be changed. So I'll go to the next slide. So breaking down a smart contract, really looking at the promises. So the promises are the contractual terms or the rule-based operations that the parties have agreed on and that carry out the exchange. It needs to be expressed in digital form, and so being reduced to software code that's then associated with the creation and recording of information in blocks in a blockchain, using protocols and algorithms to determine whether or not conditions have been met. For example, a conceptually perhaps more accessible concept is rules around release of payment. So if you had something to say, we are delivering product X from A to B, when product X leaves A, then these conditions need to be satisfied in terms of this paperwork needs to be signed, this authorization, this license, etc., etc. But those are all conditions that will either be satisfied, yes or no. And then as that product moves from A through some kind of process of transport and delivery to B, then there are a host of conditions that might be needing to be satisfied at B. And when all of those conditions are satisfied or otherwise waived, then payment can happen. So it's really trying to make it a series of yes or no decisions to try and give an outcome from delivery of product to then payment. So it sets the stage within which the parties perform. And the other idea behind smart contracts is that provided that you can set up the software code and the creation of blocks in the blockchain as the contract is performed, that this will then create outcomes which are more certain than depend on human input, because what you are doing is saying for every required element in the software code, has that being satisfied, yes or no, providing a digital form and record from product, say in the supply chain context, from product creation to product delivery. So next slide. So what do? They rely on blockchain technology, and they combine being in digital form with these protocols and algorithms that set the decisions that need to be made through the contract. Now, one of the big benefits is if you can create a smart contract in the correct way, then you can actually create a self-executing contract with predefined logic that can then actually record what is happening in real time, with the idea being minimalized human input. So that's where this idea of being self-executing and self-enforcing comes from. That said, having worked in software development for a number of years before I became a lawyer, software code is only as good as the people who code it. And so it's very important that if you're contemplating this, contemplating how these contracts are set up, that the code that underpins the contract is actually right, and it allows for the requisite number of possibilities of performance. And what I mean by that is you might have product X that's going from from step 1 to step 2, but what are all the different things, and do you care about the nature of the different things that can interrupt product delivery between 1 and 2? Does it matter if it doesn't actually ever leave stage 1? Does it matter why? If it gets interrupted in transit, does it matter why? And making sure that the code that's created deals with the different scenarios and different logic algorithms and protocols to encompass as many possibilities as you can. So hence the comment, while they remove the human element, or while they try and remove the human element and subjectivity associated with assessing whether or not performance has been met, they're not smart enough to completely avoid use for lawyers or other commercial people, because if you haven't actually contemplated a scenario that's come up in the code, then there will be a need for human intervention to say, okay, well, we didn't contemplate that. Now what are we going to do? Next slide. So looking at some early adopters, Ethereum, which I'm sure you're probably all broadly familiar with, is a cryptocurrency platform, and it's the second largest platform behind Bitcoin. It has created a decentralized open source blockchain that you can use that has smart contract functionality, meaning that you can put these terms and conditions, excuse me, and protocol and algorithms into a system on top of the blockchain, using the blocks in the blockchain to create a record as that contract is executed through. However, again, same point, it's only as good as the code underpinning them. And I think it's quite interesting to have a look at the 2017 Decentralized Autonomous Organization attack. So what this was an organization that was looking to create a system where people could put in venture capital funds around crowdsourced funding and make decisions based on this smart contract that was using the Ethereum blockchain. So what the idea was was that you had a decentralized organization, so you could have people contribute capital from all over the place. There was no ostensible management, as far as I'm aware. And once the code had been set up, the idea was that interested parties could contribute capital, and that capital would be applied and used as per the terms of the smart contract to then progress from investment into the DAO, into investments in other organisations, and basically make decisions according to what had been coded into the smart contract. The problem was that the system wasn't secure, so there was 150 million US invested, but because of the cybersecurity issues associated with what had been created, there was actually 50 million US that had been siphoned off, which was only discovered after that the event had happened. And part of the problem was that because you had a decentralized organization, it took a little time for people to regroup and actually be able to make decisions about what needed to happen. So in a more traditional organization, you would have a leadership group, whether that was a management committee, whether it was a board, whether it was something else. But the idea of having a decentralized organization with no central management core, for want of a better word, then did cause issues with trying to solve a problem which people hadn't necessarily anticipated when the smart contract was written, and then took time to sort out. So that's that one. If we go to the next slide. Another one closer to home is AgriDigital. So this is an Australian ag tech company which runs the world's first ever wheat sale software using a pilot blockchain. So what they've done is they are using blockchain. They've also created an overall platform. Oh, hang on, I've got a new message. Sorry, I'll just check. Hang on, I'll just finish this slide and then we'll have a look at that one. So basically, they've set it up on a cloud-based platform, and it is designed around the buying and selling of wheat. So it's a streamlined way to connect customers and farmers to a single live view of contracts, deliveries, orders, prices, invoicing, the whole works. So the idea being that they've tried to code a set of protocols and algorithms around the buying and selling of wheat, where different interested parties can basically use those protocols and algorithms to affect buying and selling of wheat transactions. It's, by all accounts, I think, being fairly well received. So it's just one to watch, see what happens in that space. Now we have a question from David. Is it easy to set up terms that are specific to your organisation's relationship to the counterparty? Also, how do terms get validated for logic to make sure the contract is executable? Are there experts who can look at the code? Well, look, I would say definitely that first part. Is it easy to set up terms that are specific to your organisation's relationship to the counterparty? Yes, that is entirely the point of actually trying to create a smart contract between two different organisations to make sure that it's relevant. I would imagine, though, if you're using something like AgriDigital, your capacity for tailoring to particular transactions is perhaps more limited. That said, I haven't actually used the AgriDigital platform. I'd be quite interested to have a closer look. How do terms get validated for logic? That logic is validated within the code. So the idea being that as different elements are satisfied, those are digitally inputted, and then that either satisfies a condition or it doesn't. So for example, with the moving product from one place to another, once a particular license for export, for example, has been achieved, then the party who has achieved that license for export would then input saying, yep, license for export achieved. Depending on how the smart contract's being set up, perhaps there's a third-party validation in terms of needing to upload a particular document or get an email or some other kind of external trigger satisfaction from another party to then say, yes, that term has been received and we can move on, or actually, no, that's not a license in the authorised form. No, that condition is not satisfied, we reject that, and then haven't satisfied that condition, can't move on yet. So the next slide. So Maersk, this is an interesting one. They are currently collaborating with IBM to create Trade Lens, which is a platform linking port operators, custom authorities, cargo owners, and freight forwarders. And again, I guess in a analogous way in some respects to AgriDigital, it is again just trying to find that platform where different parties can participate and use the platform to achieve what they need. So basically what they're trying to do is look at incorporating smart contract services for shipping orders and trying to automate that process through established and agreed rules that are then created around the platform and then the blockchain that flows from that. That said, with all of these, I think both with AgriDigital and Maersk, and if you go to the next slide, we've got applications in financial services in particular. None of these types of applications takes away from the fact that you do have a smart contract in context of the laws of the local jurisdiction. So laws around privacy of information, confidentiality of information, which may or may not deal with information that's private under the Privacy Acts of whatever country you're in, how IP is dealt with, looking at if something does go wrong, who actually has standing under the contract to escalate a dispute and what kind of dispute mechanism you might use, and whether or not parties, excuse me, and whether or not parties can actually interrupt the flow of the smart contract and then intercept the automated nature of the contract because there's another legal issue from the jurisdiction that's arisen, or maybe there's a change in law around licensing or approvals or permits or something that wasn't necessarily apparent when the smart contract was set up. All of these different things need to be considered so you actually do have a smart contract that fits in the context of the jurisdiction. So I think while there are many common elements that clearly create a need, I think, and also a utility for things like AgriDigital and the Maersk Trade Lens system, and really solve a number of problems in that area. That said, just because the environment that those contracts are working in is actually constantly changing, then there needs to be awareness of that issue and openness and flexibility to amending the contract as you need over time, particularly if it's something that will take more than a day or a week or a relatively short period of time to be fulfilled. If it's something that's being set up over a number of months or a number of years, then there will need to be mechanisms built in for revisions and flexibility to make sure that it actually fits with the laws of the jurisdiction that you're dealing with. There is another in the Q&A box. Okay, let's have a look. So Avinash, would smart contracts also be able to take care of import documents like bills of lading, etc., and the financial instruments like letters of credit? Yes, I think that's the part of the thinking behind that Maersk Trade Lens system. So when you do have a product that's going to be exported or imported and all the different documentation that comes with that, the idea is that to try and, I guess, alleviate some of the human labour associated with obtaining approvals and making sure that particular documents have been sent to different organisations and all this kind of detail, that can be coded into the smart contract and said, yes, this condition has been satisfied, yes, that document has been received, yes, that document has been sent. So the idea being, as far as you can, to try and automate these processes so you don't have to have human intervention when you've got systems that are receiving and giving information from one to another. And then we've got Hoda. Implementing smart contracts is going to deliver significant benefits in terms of compliance, contract management costs, etc. Those benefits aside, what are the challenges and limitations? Very good question as well. I think with that, wait for the next section, because I've talked quite a bit about a bit more of the detail. But I think, look, in terms of the high-level challenges and limitations, it's things like people being unfamiliar with the smart contract and how it should be set up. People being worried about things like cybersecurity, which are very valid concerns, and limitations around trying to get the smart contract set up with the appropriate code and the appropriate terms, try and minimize human input, but recognizing that unless you have a very well-refined system, trying to anticipate all the different scenarios that you can need to deal with under a contract can then create limitations of itself. So while you can often deal with the most common path, or maybe the common path through the contract with a couple of exceptions, the infinite variety of experience in trying to deliver under a supply contract or procure certain goods or services, Murphy's Law would say there's always things that you haven't anticipated that you can't think of necessarily right at the beginning. And so just by virtue of that, smart contracts by definition will have limitations associated with them. So here we go. Next slide, please. So blockchain and smart contracts have been applied to the supply chain, rather. And look, the two big benefits are around this automated verification and automated execution, or trying to work to achievement of that goal. The other thing that smart contracts, I think, definitely open up the possibility of, and why is it valuable? Because the volume of data that would otherwise have to be tracked, then I would argue becomes quite overwhelming for humans to keep a hold of, is recording the quantity and transfer of assets as those objects move through the supply chain. And I think this can be very powerful in terms of a range of different legal issues that we're looking at right now. Things like, you know, what kind of examples can I give you? Ethical production of meat, ethical production of resources, and trying to track where different resources have come from. Looking at impacts of things like the modern slavery legislation, and businesses needing to discharge their duty to show that all sorts of products, from textiles and clothes and objects like that, to resources, including things like rare earth metals from wherever on the planet, if you can, through an automated and changeable record, try and track how these different objects are created and their delivery to the ultimate end consumer, then that's very, very powerful. And I do think there is just too much data in it for humans to effectively track it. So if you can make it automated, that's very valuable. Another example that I came across recently, because last year I did some work with an agri startup here in WA, and had a company there that was particularly looking at tracking lambs and the delivery of mutton to market, basically. But that was right early stage. So from when an animal was born, trying to track where it was born, how it moves around the paddock, if it stops moving, and being able to intercept early, to then linking that to the supply chain. So from the farm to the abattoir to basically distribution and then delivery to the restaurant plate or the ultimate end consumer, if you can actually have visibility across data, across that chain, that can be very, very powerful. And particularly looking at applications that can self-execute and don't require a huge amount of human input, can be very powerful. Particularly, I was going to say, on the farms, apparently one of the big issues with that early stage tracking is actually access to Wi-Fi and other viable technological solutions that just haven't quite caught up yet. But I think that's an agricultural example, but I think there are lots of other applications in other industries of a similar nature where people and perhaps consumers and also government legislation is demanding greater transparency into the initial creation of a product or service and then tracking it through the supply chain to the ultimate end user and the use of that object or service. So with that, another question in the Q&A box, let's have a look. Assuming smart contracts would replace several jobs, especially at manufacturing sites, one would anticipate that that would be the case, though maybe the nature of jobs would change in terms of having people who are more technically literate for creation of these terms and oversight of the contract, just to make sure that they can basically interact with the system and use it with technical proficiency. But yeah, it's a very interesting question. I agree. Thanks, Renata. So the next question, sorry, next slide rather. Role smart contracts play in innovation. And here we have a second polling question, please. And I've just got, while we're waiting for the results of that, Avinash, thank you for the question. What do you think of BHP's recent transaction with Baoshan Steel via blockchain? Does this signal a massive shift, and do you think it will encourage more people to follow? Look, I think high-profile examples of adoption of this technology can only further the profile and the interest in that technology and try and demystify what it's all about. So hopefully, oh, there's our poll results. Hopefully that augurs well for further adoption. What would be your organisation's primary interest for adoption? Removal of paperwork and negotiation, totally. And interesting, I think the transparency and traceability, which is what we've been talking about, is important too. But I think certainly, again, just with the world always becoming more and more complex, and the level of data that people have to process and deliver and actually sensibly analyse, having technological tools like smart contracts can only assist the human aspects and efficiency of supply chains and procurement. Cost reduction is also there, and better security. All right. So next slide, please. So I think this actually probably reasonably mirrors that poll. Smart contracts can be arguably used to improve performance and really reduce work in contract administration. I do work in the supply and procurement space, but I also do quite a bit of work for different construction companies, and certainly the contract administration and making sure that everything is tracked, that variations are tracked, that you have the requisite paperwork, that extensions of time are tracked, that everything is submitted for payment claims, becomes burdensome. And if you don't have robust systems for dealing with it, then the companies can quickly become overwhelmed. And that just creates an environment for contractual disputes. Smart contracts can definitely help with that. Also, particularly in that supply and procurement space, as we had that good question about bills of lading and other documents associated with the import and export process, like letters of credit, etc. So properly coded, it can absorb the information and track it. And hopefully, when you have that smart contract interlocking with a blockchain, then you get certainty and resilience, creating those records that are immutable and unchangeable as different conditions are satisfied. So under a smart contract, when a specific event takes place, then pre-written code is triggered to run on all computers in the network, thus executing the agreement and saying the condition is satisfied or not satisfied, the idea being without human intervention. So next slide. So definitely all of these are tools. So the introduction of blockchain technology and smart contracts can assist in supply chain management. There is that visibility aspect that we were talking about before, as well as just being cognizant, excuse me, as well as just being cognizant to its interaction with a number of different electronic devices that we have now that can also give their own signals about whether different things have been done or not. So clearly we're talking about Internet of Things, but one would argue with increased automation across many different industries, just thinking about machines that load or unload ships with smarts and chips and code in them. In the building industry, you've got lots of different things connected with automated services, like when people take elevators or when people turn lights on and off in the building. On mining and oil and gas sites, you've got increased automation across the process of extraction there, from automated trucks to then those driverless trains, all sorts of different things, all of which have computer code that is running them and can then, through whatever communication mechanism, transmit data and transmit information that then can be used and inputted into a smart chain, into a smart contract rather, context. So companies may be better equipped to deal with disruptions or manage unexpected incidents with recalls or lost goods, again with having just that visibility through the chain of where something could have gone wrong, and input of these different devices into different parts of the chain, to actually then zero in on the data that's relevant to try and diagnose a problem. Arguably, it also reduces the risk of theft or fraud along the supply chain, because you're not so reliant on a human saying, yes, we've received this, or no, we haven't. But if you've got a machine which is then interacting with another machine that's provided a particular good or a particular service has been performed, then either it arguably either has or hasn't been met, and then that can be automatically recorded and brought into the smart contract and blockchain system. So next slide. Transparency, we chatted about this quite a bit, but I think again, just with that volume of data information, having a system which drills down, or which it's possible for a human, if there was the need, to drill down into particular data at a particular time, that can very much enhance transparency and recording where goods are created and identifying that particular good through the supply chain. So not just on a generic level in terms of mass production of items, but actually having a system which, in a best case scenario, could actually track the transfer and flow of one particular shipment or one particular animal through the chain, but do it in such a way that it's not prohibitively laborious or prohibitively expensive to try and keep those records, but through using these technological tools to automate it, excuse me, and become accessible information that an organisation can affordably access. So blockchain and smart contracts establish a shared secured record, and this is something that you hear a lot in this space, a single version of the truth across networks, transactions, processes, and partners in the supply chain. So it's again this idea that you have a single immutable record that is created that is correct. So I think that's, if you can get that up and functioning, it's a very powerful tool. Next slide. So traceability, again, we've chatted about this a bit, but tracking inventory, very powerful. Arguably that can reduce delays and keep the supply chain agile. So arguably gives organisations better tools to try and respond quickly to interruptions such as natural disasters or strikes or delivery accidents or other incidents which interrupt that supply chain and procurement happening. And look, just being able to also coordinate basically supply chain redundancy, for want of a better word. So if you have, again, your most common path, then maybe you have other sites or other options if that common path gets disrupted, and then being able to more effectively draw on those alternate resources and put that into the main chain, then that would also be very powerful, and smart contracts provide you with the tools to do that. We have some more questions, so just quickly in the Q&A. Now, just trying to, here we go. So I've got a question from VJ, thank you. Supply chain 3 items on the flow of goods, information and cash. Stephanie, can you please add some light? Blockchain and supply chain management with reduce the bullwhip effect. And I think that's the same question there. Again, look, just trying to, it's just another tool for solving known issues. So really it would depend in relation to the flow of goods, information and cash on what kind of code the parties have adopted. But certainly I would imagine that things like that Trade Lens platform and the Agri-Digital really try and actively manage known problems, and as they are refined, become more effective at doing so. Alison, thank you for your question. Do you see smart contracts as an opportunity to manage regulations in the industry more efficiently, ensuring milestones or actions by a company complying with regulations? Look, it's a very interesting question, and you would hope yes. I've done a lot of work in the oil and gas space, and certainly the volume of regulation there is large, this particularly in the upstream oil and gas space, and trying to give companies tools to stay on top of that, whether that's in relation to environment issues or occupational health and safety issues, or you know, the rules around how exploration or production is conducted on a particular permit, what kind of reporting you have to give at what particular time, across a host of different regulations, both at a national basis and at a state basis, and then additional local government requirements. That's huge. There is so much regulation that you have to be cognizant of and report on and be up to speed with. And it doesn't stay static, it changes all the time. So one would hope things like smart contracts could really assist with that. We have another question. How much impact can we expect with AI, automation, blockchain, machine learning, realistically speaking? Imtiaz, thank you for your question. Look, I think that's $1 million question. If I knew the answer to that, then I probably wouldn't be doing what I was doing. But I think what I will say is this. I see things like blockchain and smart contracts and its interaction with machine learning and AI and all these types of technologies that are really the subject of heavy R&D at the moment as likely to be a significant part of the future. Automation is increasing, it's not decreasing, and certainly things that I say not in the smart contract space, but say in the automated vehicle space, things which were inconceivable a generation ago are now happening. You know, you've got Tesla trying to move forward with self-driving cars. You don't have full self-driving cars yet, but the latest model Teslas will drive unassisted, though the person has to sit in the driver's seat. That technology is only going to get refined. I would argue this in the same manner. My prediction would be with things like smart contracts and blockchain and AI and machine learning, people do see these as great tools, I think, to manageably and sensibly interpret vast volumes of data. And I think once you have all these different data collection points and you do have reasonably complicated supply chains in multiple jurisdictions with multiple data flows, it just quickly spirals out of control and isn't possible for humans to actually interpret and make sense of that data quickly enough without machine help. So I think, look, it'd be interesting to see, say, fast forward 20 years, which parts of those technologies have gained traction and which were, scenarios and possibilities that ended up being stubs. But I think the general push down that path is pretty much, I would argue, unlikely to be unstoppable. I think the only thing that would seriously disrupt it is if we had some kind of massive event or massive energy crisis, which meant that we couldn't actually all have a smartphone that was powered or electronic devices that were powered, because clearly if we don't have electricity and things aren't powered, then all of this shuts down. But absent that, it'd be hard to see it stopping in its tracks or being wound back. How are we going? Are there other questions? So I thought there was one about Internet of Things. I won't look for it now. We can circle back. One more question. Imtiaz, advice for those who want to move into operations and the management side of supply chains but only have blue collar skills. What are some of the skills one can acquire to succeed? Very good question. I'm actually really interested as to what kinds of training courses and other like services exist in this space. Off the top of my head, I can't answer that, but I'd be really curious if maybe the participants know of different courses and resources and what have you people could avail themselves of to try and make that transition from, as you mentioned, being a blue collar worker working in the space to then getting the technological skills that you need to actually work with and implement supply, or rather smart contracts in the supply and procurement space. So yeah, great question. But if any of our participants have got ideas, then please post them into the chat. So hang on, I'm just conscious of time. So just quickly, I might just go on to the next slide. And here we just have our final poll. Final poll question. I'm just checking. Oh no, sorry. I've got our third poll question. Oh, where's it gone? Lovely. So this is around collaboration. Again, just trying to smooth the path between the interaction between large organisations and SMEs. And large organisations clearly often have much better developed, better refined systems than SMEs. So maybe smart contracts is a way to try and ease the collaboration between those organisations. So put your thoughts in there, it's multiple choice. Let's have a look. So we've got the results. Oh, interesting. Yeah, credentialing and less likelihood for disputes. Those look like the front runners, and increased certainty about work product. Yes, very, very definitely. Thank you very much for that. So look, I am conscious of time. I just wanted to just give you a flavour of the types of legal impacts we're talking about. So next slide. Legal position, right? The point here, the takeaway point is just having something in code doesn't necessarily make a contract. You still need to turn your mind to the jurisdiction that you're with, make sure that you actually have something that is legally enforceable. Why? Because if the smart contract code and the system on the blockchain doesn't help you, you may ultimately need to flex your legal rights. And to do that, then you need to make sure that a court in the relevant jurisdiction that you're dealing with will actually agree with you that you are contractually bound to the party that you're dealing with, and there is a dispute to be heard and resolved. So next one. This harkens back to the point that I was making a few slides ago about these don't exist in a vacuum. Always need to be cognizant of the environment and the laws of that environment that you're dealing with, as well as cybersecurity risks, and making sure that the system itself is actually as secure as it needs to be. And I think that distributed autonomous organization example with the loss of that 50 million US is a salutary lesson to people trying to adopt smart contracts and operate in this space. And next slide. IP, talked about that. In a very similar way to supply and procurement chains, if you consider that IP could be an object like a product or a service that can be bought and sold or otherwise licensed, then the same lessons around traceability and security and transparency apply. So next slide. Managing performance and disputes. This is a really interesting one, and I'm just very conscious of the fact that we have an hour together, and this is probably a topic that we could probably spend quite a few days talking about. There's recognised problems with, say, dispute resolution in Australia in terms of the fact that our courts are overloaded, slow, expensive. They do their best, but there is a large volume of work to be done. And a number of people want to litigate, and all those people have a fair right to be heard. In terms of alternative dispute resolutions, there are a number of mechanisms that are available and accessible, but some of those are arguably quite expensive and slow too. Things like arbitration or other dispute resolution mechanisms. So there is a growing body of thought around, if you have the smart contract that has particular dispute resolution elements in it, maybe that is an alternative dispute resolution mechanism which may assist parties resolve disputes and to keep people out of the courts, keep people out of alternative dispute resolution as more traditionally defined, if you have a better way for solving disputes basically coded up and agreed as part of the contract. I would say it's definitely worth thinking about and looking at because it's a recognised issue. Dealing with disputes effectively is a recognised issue. Next slide. Managing performance and disputes, if set up correctly, they should be self-executing. That said, they can go through revisions like anything else. So you set up one, execute on that. If there's information and other changes necessary, or there's changes in legislation, then that would have to be built into the next. But certainly, it gives you a good basis to start from. That said, there are things like what I've mentioned as equitable remedies, but basically other actions that parties may want to take that don't necessarily lend themselves to being coded into a smart contract. So next slide. And then again, comes back to that same point. You are not in a vacuum. You need to be cognizant of the jurisdiction that you're in and your contractual rights at law. So if something does happen and needs to escalate, then you have the comfort of knowing that you have that protection too. So next slide. So very much striking a balance between using the tool of a smart contract set against the legal backdrop that you're operating in. I'm just going through these quickly because I'm conscious of time. So next slide. That is the end. We do have one final poll. Here we go. So from your perspective, what do you consider, what appears to you as the biggest legal risk in blockchain and smart contracts? Let's have a look at what people had to say. Interesting. I chose the cybersecurity and privacy. I'm always very concerned about that. But lack of regulation and legislation, I think that's true too. Interesting in that DAO example, once you start involving people from multiple jurisdictions, you have a whole host of issues that arise from that in terms of if there were disputes that needed to be escalated, how does that happen? Which laws take precedence? All these sorts of interesting questions. Now look, we are at 12. I can still see there's some questions there. So Monique, how do we feel? Do you want me to just spend a couple of minutes looking at people's questions? Or do people have to go? What's the
sure, over to you, Indresen. Thanks.
Okay. I think, Stephanie, given time, I think our commitment is 12 o'clock. I think maybe we can reply to them in the post when we post the stuff for the webinar.
Great.
There's 2 questions there, if we could do that. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Quite a vast topic, interesting, emerging topic, and thank you very much for taking the time to share. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. I think fantastic questions, really good participation. And just a reminder to everybody going forward, there's the next couple of webinars, very exciting one about filling in your awards for the ASCI conference, some best practice, and a masterclass by Indrajit Virdi, who's got experience in this. And then another important topic in SNOP and IBP. I saw the question on bullwhip effect. Here's another excellent webinar that will talk into some of that. And then in terms of CPD points, those of you I saw some put in there, please do so if you haven't already. And thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you guys at the next webinar. Take care, everybody. Cheers. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.